Test. Ok, ok, test.
Già è brutto, ma da qua è proprio brutto brutto. Sì. Salgo? Vengo su?
I'm fine, fine, fine. I'm fine. And you? Great. Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Yes. Yeah, but
E no, c'era anche un Osho. Aspetta, lo so mangiato. Valla a rifare al volo, Ale, ma c'è. Posto? Li stavi leggendo?
Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for remaining here. Let me introduce this nice lecture from Giorgio Wusu that is coming from Accra University. We are very pleased to have another African here speaking about Africa. This is our aim in this 2019. The idea of FEEM is a series of lectures about Africa, the changing we have now in Africa, how to focus on this changing. So we hosted during this year 3 interesting personalities, Mokhtar Sakande from FAO, and then Bilal Begasho from SDGs Center for Africa in Rwanda. And now we have Giorgio Wusu. During this autumn, we will have here to speak Otto Bicocca about African diaspora here in Italy. So on October 10th, we will have here this interesting personality that is now president of the African Union of Communities in Italy. And then on November 20th, we will have Fatima Denton that will speak about energy in Africa, decarbonization. So we will be very pleased if you would like to be here and to follow our lecture during next steps and years on. So thank you, Professor Wusu. So I give you the floor for this lecture that is called African Cities, Change and Challenges. And at the end of this lecture, we will have a short film projection in about 20 minutes. That is called Un enfant perdu. It's from the COE archives here in Milan. That is linked to the lecture Giorgio Wusu will deal tonight. And then we will have an actor cocktail at the end, so around 7:30. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronica. And let me also thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this event. Before I go on, let me say something. I think when I got chance to see the topic that I was supposed to work on for presentation here, I was a bit challenged, you know, seeing the word challenges in the topic and talking about Africa. But I think I'm being more challenged looking at the first part of today's event, the interesting discussion we've had from David, Simon, and the other 2 presenters. Clearly, I think a lot has been discussed in the first session, and that even makes my work even harder. But the good news is that you asked me to do a lecture, so I've put something down, and I'm not going to go off script. So thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everyone. I would like to say that listening to the 3 first presenters, you get a sense that there are a number of narratives about the process of urbanization and cities in Africa. And these narratives basically, sometimes when you listen to them, sometimes assume that African cities are basically some of the worst places for people to live and associated with survival strategies. Though African cities are saddled with challenges, they remain places of opportunity for its people, as well as many others, including even multinational companies. Indeed, urban sustainability issues in many African countries are best observed when you look at challenges confronting our cities. Yet, the good news is that urban life in Africa has not collapsed. And in many African countries, that is so largely on account of the informal sector. And this is something that I will explain to you later on. So in this lecture, I provide a general overview of African cities, their changing nature and challenges. And what I've done is that I've structured the discussion into 5 parts. First, I'll look at the different narratives about African cities. Next, I'll look at Africa's urban revolution. followed by an overview of the continent's urban development challenges. And then I'll look at African cities and informality, and then I'll end the lecture with some concluding remarks. I will start by talking about narratives about African cities by telling you of a story I had with an American professor a few years ago in Accra. I met this professor at an international conference organized by the World Bank and other international donors on poverty and pro-poor policies. This conference was held in one of Ghana's well-known five-star hotels, which overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. I was fortunate during the conference to have sat very close to this professor, and we had the opportunity of introducing ourselves. And then I got to know then that that was his first time of visiting Africa, or visiting any African country, and for that matter, Ghana. So he told me that earlier on he has been to Accra, following a tour guide, visiting some interesting places in Accra, and he has taken pictures of Accra. He has also taken pictures of the beautiful scenes of the hotel, and that he was going to send this to the wife in the United States. Later on the day, he approached me, and I saw that he wasn't looking too cheerful. And I asked him whether something was wrong with him. He said he sent the picture to the wife, and the wife has angrily responded that, "Are you sure you're in Africa?" The wife, basically looking at the pictures from parts of Accra that he has visited, and also pictures from the hotel, was doubting whether he was truly in Africa. This is not an isolated story to tell. Personally, traveling around the world, I've had several such encounters, and questions have been asked of cities in Ghana and other African countries, and what and how they look like. So I've come to the conclusion, and basically looking at the literature, that there are several narratives about cities and urbanization in Africa. There are several of them, but I would like to highlight only 4 of these. First, the narratives of Africa are still rural and practicing communal living, despite data from recent decades indicating the rapid shift of population towards towns and cities still prevail very strong out there. In fact, in some African countries themselves, the policy agencies in charge of urban development still highlight rural development rather than urban development. And I'll give the example of my own country, Ghana. In Ghana, the current estimate put the total population living in urban centers at almost about 58%. Yet the policy agency in charge of urban development is called the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. In this narrative, there's also the tendency to see rural and urban areas in Africa as separable entities. And I'm happy that in the last session, the issue about rural-urban linkages was highlighted. This is after decades of research and policy implementation have indicated that rural and urban development are inseparable and closely connected. Indeed, integrated rural development programs implemented in many parts of the developing world, including Africa, in the 1970s and early parts of the 1980s, placed great emphasis on peasant farmer and the rural agriculture economy. But many of these programs failed due to what many analysts partly attributed to the failure to give adequate attention to the role of urban centers in the rural economy. The second narrative that I would like to talk about is about the fact that some have argued that what is happening in Africa in terms of urbanization is basically what has happened in the past in the global north. And that is really something which has been separated by time and space. In other words, a better understanding of the urbanization process in Africa requires comparative analysis with that of the global north. Put simply, the urbanization process in Africa is the same as that which occurred in North America, Europe, and other urbanizing societies, though separated by time and space. These narratives have served to capture Africa's urbanization, sometimes in Eurocentric terms. The third narrative, which is of quite recent, is the fact that there seems to be suggestion that Africa is de-urbanizing and that Africans are returning to rural areas as strongly put by Potts in her work 2009 to 2012. She has argued forcefully, based on census data, that on recent census reports, that the demographic process in Africa, that the shift of the population from rural to urban, is slowing down or stagnating in most African countries. And in some cases, she described this as counter-urbanization and gave the example of Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali. In other cases, he observed weak city immigration, giving examples of my own country, Ghana, Benin, and Mozambique, and that it's only in a few countries that there's really some form of urbanization. And the examples were Tanzania, Kenya, and Niger. I've argued that if this thesis of de-urbanization is indeed the case, it raises questions about the long-held view of urbanization as inevitable and irreversible, and therefore puts African countries as possibly the first to have experienced this. In a work that I've done with my colleague, Tiambe Bio, 2005, we have argued that this view has far-reaching implications for the urbanization agenda, as the need for central government and metropolitan authorities in African cities to adequately prepare for high levels of urbanization is in doubt and needs to be put on hold. The fourth narrative is what Simoni, 2008 narratives, describe as the distinctive features of the informalized and the often poor, resource-poor urban environment that African cities are often associated with. Something you can exemplify with Mike Davis' own Planets of Slums. Various estimates put sub-Saharan Africa in the lead as the region with the highest proportion of urban dwellers living in slums. In some cases, the estimate put this as almost 7 or over 7 in 10 people living in cities in Africa are living in slums. Even higher estimates are provided in some specific cases, citing Ethiopia and Nigeria. Yet, if you look at the indicators for defining slums, they are largely conceived out of the cultural context and social reality of Africa. Indeed, the estimated high incidence of slums and the description of the associated poor environment have often been described sometime in political terms, and some estimates suggest that almost all urban dwellers are basically living in slums. Nevertheless, as argued by Obumbula et al., 2014, and others, evidence to date suggests that clearly, if you look at our slums, they do not only contain the poor, but they also have the rich and the well-to-do. In these narratives, what we can say is that the rapid urbanization occurring on the continent is largely characterized by rapid urban sprawl and the emergence of slums and other informal settlements as common features of cities in African cities. And these cities, as I've argued, do harbor the poor. But this does not tell the full or the whole story of cities and urbanization on the continent. Indeed, evidence indicates that cities and towns really do draw the poor, but they are also places of opportunity. And despite the fact that conditions may be appalling in some parts of our cities, they are still seen as places of opportunity, and that is the more reason why we have the continuous flow of people into our cities. Let me show you this, basically, the recent data from the UN regarding urban population growth rate across the world. And you can see quite clearly the growth rate between now, the projection from now to 2018. You see that in terms of the growth rate, Africa is still, in terms of, it's not a fully urbanized, but the growth rate clearly is there for everybody to see. And then if you go back to 1970, in terms of the proportion urbanized and city sizes, you can clearly count the number of cities which were in the million category in 1970 on the continent, and also the colors depicting the proportion living in towns and cities. This is 1970. And quite clearly, if you go to about 1990, you see things changing. You come to 2008, you see more of the blues, emphasizing strongly that truly there's something happening on the continent, both in terms of city sizes and the growth rate, and it's generally across the country. And the projection for 2030, as has been said earlier in the first session, is quite clear that many countries on the continent, even if there are differences, are going to be well urbanized. And we are going to see mega cities and large cities across the country like it is in other parts of the world. And then you look at this table, basically, which more like summarizes the picture from 1950 to 2050, the projection. And you see quite clearly, yes, Africa is, the level of urbanization is low, but the continent is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And clearly, you can also see the differences across the regions. But what is quite clear is that despite that, the differences, all regions, all sub-regions across the continent are urbanizing, and they are urbanizing rapidly. And even some of these figures, if you look at the individual countries, I've shown here, what I show here is the projection for Ghana, the work that we did for our National Development Planning Commission quite recently. And Ghana, former census started way back in 1921. And you can see the blue, which depicts the urban, and the orange color, which depicts the rural. And you see quite clearly what we anticipate that from now on to 2050, what is going to happen. And so, across the continent, the rate of urbanization, or the rapid rate of urbanization, is no doubt, there's no question about that. What I can sum from the figures and tables I've shown is that they demonstrate quite clearly that there is an urban transition underway in Africa. And as Panda and Peters in 2014 argued, an urban revolution exhibits profound urbanization that is significant shift and concentration of the population in towns and cities with its associated wider social implications within a short period of time. Indeed, I share the view of Grant 2015 that the urbanization in Africa is not yet complete, but its trajectory seems inevitable. Beyond the statistics, anecdotal evidence suggests quite clearly that across the continent, there's the increasing shift or movement of the population from rural to urban areas, as evident in the increasing, as evident in massive expansion of cities and towns, as well as the urban sprawl I've talked about, and particularly around many of our large cities, the rapid conversion of villages and small settlements in towns, and so on and so forth. But with this sort of rapid urbanization comes what we call the challenges. I would say that Africa's urbanization challenges have taken on a more center stage, and I'm not in any way going to deny these challenges. From Cairo in North Africa to Cape Town in the south, Nairobi in the east, and Lagos in West Africa, African cities are saddled with numerous challenges. And as noted earlier, sustainability questions in African countries are best observed through the challenging confronting cities on the continent. In this, I've tried to summarize, because basically if I want to talk about the challenges, probably I would be talking about them for the whole day. But I've tried to summarize, as you've seen in the slide. One of the key for me is the weak urban planning and the urban governance systems in many of our cities, which negatively impact on the capacity of cities to provide the required infrastructure and services for their citizens and businesses, thus limiting the capacity of African countries to be very competitive. Indeed, in many African countries, poor urban planning and governance remain the core challenges, as they impaired creativity and innovation required to address other urban development challenges. In fact, from the first presentation, many of the slums, I can speak for Ghana and many cities on the continent, many of the slums exist, and the way they are simply sometimes due to the fact that it's the way the governance system are structured. They don't allow people to bring in their creativity and also allow cities authority to have the creativity to be able to address the challenge. And so you have the prevailing slum condition. So sometimes the slums are there not because people are poor, but the existing governance structure make them so. The second challenge I will talk about briefly is the massive urban sprawl, which is against the background of the unique circumstance of intense city congestion, largely as a result, as I've said earlier, of the weak urban planning with negative consequences on infrastructure and service provision. And it goes on. It impacts negatively on transport, issues about pollution and environmental degradation, and the high cost of doing business. And also, it leads to African countries, African cities, having huge ecological footprints. But it also related to that is the rapid loss of rural agricultural land and livelihood, with implication for food security due to the rapid urban sprawl and city expansion, and which I've said is partly due to poor planning and development control. And then there are the issues of our housing deficit and then development of informal settlements and slums. And this situation in many cases serve as the basis for city authorities to undertake demolition exercise by clearing slums and informal settlements, which also come with some hardships, including the displacement of people and livelihoods. The next challenge is the environmental degradation due to poor sanitation and waste management practices, issues about air pollution, destruction of ecological sensitive areas, including wetlands and other similar sites, which clearly, once in the era when we are talking about climate change, has serious implications for our long-term sustainability. And then, lastly, issues about unemployment. Like many cities in the world, African cities have struggled to create jobs for the millions who reside in them. So high employment in many African cities are the result of the large number of young people present in these localities. And also, as a continent, we are yet to really benefit from our demographic dividends in terms of having young people within our economy. And also, it has to do partly with the issues about the structure of our economy and the fact that agriculture has continually remained unattractive to the youth. So it serves as the basis of pushing people to the urban areas in search of other alternatives. I would say that despite all this, a key question that we need to ask ourselves is why, with all the seemingly negative developments and challenges, urban life, as I said earlier, has not collapsed in African cities. The answer to this question lies with the urban informal economy. Indeed, it is the urban informal sector which provides majority of urban citizens with shelter, employment, income, transport, and any claims on consumption of goods and services in many African countries. According to ASAN 2019, African cities are presented as places of regeneration of resources and locations which favor more varied strategies of survival. And the crisis of the African city has sometimes blamed on its informality, illegality of its economy. However, Jenkinson 2009 has described this argument as misleading because the informal sector of African cities find legitimacy in economic, social, and cultural structures which originated in the pre-colonial era, has survived the colonial era, and even benefited in the post-colonial era. Indeed, if there is any success to be associated with the urbanization in Africa, I argue that there are a number of them, the informal sector is a major contributor to these successes. Rapid urbanization across the continent in recent decades have coincided with improved economic growth in many countries, and Africa now has some of the fastest growing economies in the world. The informal sector has contributed very strongly in creating jobs, and we've seen that the phenomenal growth of job opportunity which the informal sector has created as a result of mobile telephony and the ICT industry, to the extent that today that sector has completely restructured the banking sector in many African countries. We've seen increase in human capital, particularly in the area of school enrollment and education and literacy, largely to the fact that people are moving to cities, and that is where they get easily access to schools, and that they are able to educate themselves and to improve on themselves. We've seen enhanced vibrancy of our civil society, including the use of social media as a tool for fighting corruption and promoting governance. Much of that take place in our cities, and cities have really contributed in that respect. We've seen decreasing levels of poverty across many African countries, which is due to expanded opportunities and improved living conditions for millions. Largely, this has happened to people who are living in cities. So, at this point, I would like to turn my attention a bit and look at the informal sector, the African cities and informal sector, which I would argue is basically have stood up as a key sector in addressing many of the challenges confronting us. I argue that difficulties involved in capturing all the different dimensions of the urban informal economy has led to varied definitions of the sector. According to BAR 2007, despite the difficulties in definition, there is some level of consensus that the urban informal economy refers to various socioeconomic activities which are officially not regulated and operate outside existing formally defined laws and regulations. BAR adds that the informal economic activities in Africa are not hidden. They are perfectly legal and provide livelihood to urban residents. In other words, informality in Africa does not represent illegality. The debate about what constitutes the informal sector in Africa has received extensive attention in the literature. And while I do not intend to go into this debate, it is sufficient to say that the sector is opposite to the formal sector, but connected to it and its survival in very ways. What I mean is that the informal sector in Africa is not something that stands alone. It is well connected to the formal sector. I argue that the future of most African cities and the national economies of many countries will depend on what is done to ensure that the informal sector becomes progressively more productive and more entrepreneurial. However, despite its significant contribution to the city and national economies, informal economic activities lack policies which support its activities, as well as the operators in the sector. In many African cities, the lack of adequate policy attention to the informal sector has led to a situation whereby spatial planning has failed to consider informal economic activities in planning and development of zoning schemes. This has resulted in clashes or conflicts between informal economic operators and local authorities, mainly on the issue of location. Often observed these days on radio, television screens, and increase on social media platforms are accounts of the destruction and disruption of livelihoods of informal operators, with serious consequences for poverty reduction and the overall growth of the urban and the national economy. The burden of such exercises fall disproportionately on the millions of the youth who have flocked to or who have moved to urban areas in search of non-existent jobs in the formal sector, but who have creatively find livelihood in this sector. Be it, when I talk about the formal sector, I mean both the public and the private sector, subsectors. In many cities in Africa, dealing with informality has entailed taking on some Eurocentric notions of the city and utopian notions of urban development. Rather than asking how urban dwellers in African cities manage to create their own mechanism of production and sustenance within existing societal structures, city and national government have often continually pushed a development agenda of seeking to make African cities to conform to development norms of cities in the global north, usually citing city beautification to attract foreign tourists, businesses, and investments, and to make way for new flagship developments. For example, roads and multi-story upscale shopping malls gated communities for the wealthy residents, and so on and so forth, informal economic activities and their operators tend to bear the brunt of such interventions. In a work that I've done with my colleague Krenzel, we have argued that even in countries where democracy and rule of law have taken firm hold and where citizens are accorded some rights, such practice of destruction of the informal sector are very frequent with serious implications such as I've said already, displacement of population and livelihood. And many of these tend to impact on the youth and women and their livelihood. A case in point is Ghana, where city authorities, bearing in mind the often backlash against the use of the term slum clearance, have coined the term decongestion. In Ghana, they've coined the term decongestion. And decongestion is simply a simplistic and disguised approach for removing areas of the city that city authorities see as undesirable. And that exercise has been carried on for the last decades. And in some cases, even when citizens have challenged this in court, in some cases they've been successful, but in many cases they've not been successful. So even in countries where citizens have the right to seek justice, city authorities and national government have found ways or means of basically removing areas within the city environment that they see as undesirable. The reality of the informal sector as the largest provider of housing, employment, and other socio-economic opportunities in Accra and many other cities in Africa is yet to gain that needed attention of city and policymakers in Africa. This raises the broader question about the right to the city and the need to promote inclusive and sustainable urban development. As Steele et al. 2014 argue, evidence to date suggests that the targeting of informal economic activities, as well as removing areas within the city that city authorities do not like, have not simply deterred the influx of the poor or the marginalized into African cities. People still move to African cities because they still see cities as places of opportunity and where they think they'll be able to move away from poverty. As I come to the last session of my lecture, I would like to share with you some concluding remarks. I conclude my lecture by noting once again that the urban transition underway in Africa offers huge opportunities for the continent, but at the same time, there are several challenges to overcome. Basically, I would like to highlight 4 areas as critical to African cities achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, with the targeted goals for affordable housing, basic services, accessible and safe transport, and safety of citizens, especially for women. The first that I would like to highlight is that urban planning and city management in general need to take a serious view of the urban informal sector as a true reflection of the African city and not as a nuisance that needs to be written off. Consequently, I argue that policies and strategies must be deployed, including infrastructure and services, to support the informal sector. Also, city and national government, as well as international development partners, need to accept that the informal sector will continue to evolve and will also be in a constant state of flux, with some aspects remaining informal, whilst other parts are being formalized. The second point that I would like to note is that in many rapidly ever-growing African cities, addressing the challenges of cities require the need to view these cities as a system in which the different range of challenges are interconnected and interlinked, with common underlying political economic factors impeding effort to address these challenges. Consequently, issues of inadequate infrastructure and services, severe housing deficit and slums, poor sanitation and waste management, limited job opportunity, and so on, require the recognition of the fact that each city as a system. This therefore demands that addressing all these challenges at the same time in order to make African cities livable and competitive. The sectoral approach we've had in the past to tackle African cities challenges have proven largely inadequate. For example, Smith et al. 2017 have argued that to address informal settlements and challenges requires systems approach whereby these settlements are seen as integral parts of the city. They argue further where there is little or no government support for slum livelihoods and where slums are not integrated into the broader urban environment, long-term inequality and intergenerational disadvantages are perpetuated or being created. The third point, which I will strongly emphasize, which is somehow also related to the system thinking, is the need to pay both policy and investment attention to small and medium-sized or secondary cities in Africa. Too often, national government and international development partners have tended to focus on large cities and metropolitan centers to the neglect of secondary cities. In particular, improving transportation and other connectivity infrastructure between cities and small and medium-sized towns can serve as the basis for not only enhancing rural-urban linkages and the development of these secondary cities and the regional and the national economies, but also address some of the core challenges of large cities, including their unsustainable ecological footprints. Fourthly and lastly, I would like to re-echo the argument of some urbanists in the global south, specifically for Africa, for a re-theorizing of the African city. And here I would like to quote Susan Parnell and Jennifer Robinson, and I quote from their 2012 study. Our overall argument is that because of the traditional focus and structure of knowledge production, characterized by an unequal distribution of scholars and research resources across the world of cities, some areas of theoretical work receive disproportionate visibility. Some theoretical ideas are misappropriated, and many questions are potentially more relevant to illuminating the 21st century city are left relatively undeveloped, largely because of a lack of critical engagement. Theories that might work for the global north, like analysis of urban regimes, detailed accounts on gentrification, former urban renewal processes, and so on, are mobilized inappropriately to interpret contexts in which the associated processes are less important, where they can be understood only alongside other drivers of change, or where they do not apply at all. Indeed, on the basis of this argument, I argue that the ongoing urban transition in Africa calls for a shift and adjustment regarding the narratives about Africa's urbanization and its cities, and how ideas are conceived and applied, given the continent's unique urbanization experiences. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Obuzu. Is there any question from the floor?
Thank you. I will ask you, I imagine that I'm here, I imagine that you use this kind of content and approach with your students, and I would like to know what is the reaction of your students about this kind of approach. They accept it, they contest it, they introduce and arouse new ideas.
Thank you very much for your question. I think you are right. I've had this question not only talking to students but also talking to city authorities in Ghana. I think that the idea is not just to reject it or to accept it, but in many cases the issue has been we need to be critical of whatever we are doing, whether it's coming from whether the idea is coming from within or coming from outside. So the idea is for a critical engagement of whatever thoughts or whatever interventions we seek to implement or to propose. So that's how I see it. And I must say that the question about cities has really, until quite recently, you know, cities the question about cities and the challenges haven't engaged the attention of many policymakers on the continent. And I say that if you look at the countries in Africa which have formulated urban policies in recent years, it's only quite recent. I gave you the statistics for Ghana, and I can tell you that Ghana only developed a national urban policy just in 2012, despite the fact that for all these years, and actually in 2010, we crossed the urban divide. That for the first time in our history, there were more people living in cities than rural areas. I think for me, there has been some ambivalent attitude towards cities, that possibly the challenges confronting us in our cities will probably automatically go away with time. But in case it's becoming very clear that they are not going to go away unless we really put in conscious effort or make conscious effort to address these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. You have mentioned a phenomenon that occurs when you have rapid sprawl, rapid urban sprawl, where there is this formally urbanized center surrounded by this informally formed periphery. And we know that when new master plans in these situations are developed, they tend to just bulldozer over the informally developed areas. Do you know of any new master plans that are made and that care about the social sustainability in these situations?
Yeah. You saw the presentation by the third presenter on that Ethiopia basically every 13th year has a new plan. I can say that in other African countries that is even better. In my own country there are so many plans. The question has always been how do you the implementation, and that brings into question the question about the politics and so on. For Ghana, I mean that concern the case of Ghana. You know, quite recently we're developing a 40-year plan. A new government comes into place and it's changing the whole thing altogether. So, and for those of you who know Accra has consistently had a very good plan. Consistent, good structural plan. The problem has been implementation. The ability of our cities and institutions to be able to follow through the policies and plans and to implement them. So, in many African countries, the question is not the absence of planning, but it's more to do with the implementation of plan.
Okay. I have there are many questions, but let me try to identify some. First of all, I mean, I can say that when the implementation is a problem, it means that the plan is not well designed. And the concept of design is not only related, let's say, to, I mean, urban design, architectural aspect, etc., spatial and functional, but also to institutional and legal framework, as well as the capacity of managing the market. So this is a first comment. Second comment, coming back to the the informality, I think that there is not a linear correlation between income distribution and informality. You can have, I mean, informal, very rich informal activities, very rich informal people. I mean, you can have even high standard house, I mean, that belongs to the informal sector. So we have to be aware of the way we are defining informal. I agree with you when you say that the informal sector is a source of resources, is a resource of creativity and roles, but is also a radical critic to the mainstream economy or economics, the economical policies and planning. And this is, I mean, another questions that I think deserve attention. Another aspect, for instance, in Ethiopia, mid-80s, the informal employment in Addis Ababa was around 20%. Of course, it was an estimate, but based on the interesting survey. Now is higher. Is around 30-35% on the basis of, different sources that have to be, of course, control, etc., etc. But, you know, the contribution of informal sector to the urban GDP, gross domestic product, I mean, you know, assuming anyway this parameter as meaningful, is even higher. So it means that the informal sector somehow has a higher productivity, you know, with the 35% of employment in informal sector, you can guarantee almost 45-50% of the informal urban GDP. The last two questions, you know, I fully agree with you when you say that we have to be careful about the urban system policies and the secondary cities. But, you know, we have really to work carefully about the urban-rural exchange. I think that, you know, this aspect is very important for the population resource balance in a country, you know, for, the environment, for, the sustainable policies for the future. And in the urban, national urban policies, as I told you before, in different countries, this aspect is not considered properly. The last question is rethinking African cities. I think that we have even to rethink the urban component of rural population.
Thank you. Are you done? Can I respond?
Yes, yes, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I thought you had Savannah more comment. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think I shared many of the comments that you've made. But on the issue about the planning, I think you can have a very nice plan, well formulated, but that plan can be undermined by the existing governance structure. I don't know whether you agree with me. That you can have a very well-designed plan, well thought through, and everything, but that plan can be. And let me give you a typical example. When you have central government appointing your mayors, when you have a central government appointing your mayor for the city, and that mayor and the top blast or the policy makers at the very top look up to the central government, not to the city and the citizens. It is very, very difficult for the city to be able to be forward-looking. And in many African countries, that is, in my own country, that's what happens. And so what happens is that nice plans are developed. And because of the nature of our governance structure at the city level, the sort of innovation and creativity that should even go into looking for funding to implement the plan doesn't happen. You can go to Accra and ask the mayor what is the proportion of his revenue that comes from property rate. You know, so that is the sort of thing, situation that I'm talking of, whereby you can have a very well-developed plan, but if the underlying governance structure is not solid, you are not going to get make any headway. Yeah, the informal sector is critical. But once again, you know, the issue about the similar unproductivity of the informal sector can sometimes also be blamed on the formal sector, because the formal sector is supposed to support the informal sector. And so, whereby, for example, in a city, you've not developed the right tools and so on to be able to tax from informal operators. What happens is that they operate, they make demand on the service infrastructure within the city, but they don't contribute to paying up for the use of those, service infrastructure. And that's what happens in many of our cities. And that, in a way, also saddles the city with with the burden of not being able to provide the needed resources and infrastructure to be able to be more forward-looking. I think I will end here.
Just one more question, okay?
Hello. I was wondering that if you bring attention to sometimes in African countries, not all, but they suffer from conflicts, internal conflicts. Yeah. So basically, not all the population are built as planned. Some people are forced to live in areas and find the simple definition of shelters, and that sometimes cause problems from fighting water pollution and stuff like that. So you basically mentioned the majority of the challenges, but I think that, I don't know, maybe conflicts in some countries can be like challenges for some. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you're perfectly right. Yeah, conflict, even in so-called peaceful countries, sometimes internal conflict can create a problem. We have one big slum in Ghana, in the city, and basically that slum came about as a result of intertribal conflict in the northern part of the country, and which then resulted in people being forcibly moved from where they were living and coming. So conflict do, and I've seen studies done on Liberia and then Sierra Leone, which suggests that the conflict basically pushed people from rural areas to the city, and the associated challenges with that.
So, thank you very much, Professor Buso. So we are ready to see this short movie about 20 minutes. So thank you.